Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. And we'll just call this the radical teaching. Dan and I have been simplifying this work on YouTube and different social media platforms to make sure that everybody understands the basics and how to find, in just a beginner's way, how suffering, everyday suffering, comes from unprocessed emotion that you cannot feel. It's buried. And we've been teaching in this simpler style to help people, move along in this work in the way that we have developed it. We also do other things. It's just like free expression, and you'll see that stuff on our social media. But someone has asked me to do the more radicalized version of this work. Not that I haven't done it already. and I did say that. I was like, well, did you know that I've done the podcast, All Your Suffering is Connected to One Thing? That episode is on this podcast series, and that's highly recommended for people who want just the straight talk about how, well, all your suffering is connected to one thing, which is the network of programs, just 2 or 3 programs, really, for the most part, that run all of your suffering from the unconscious level. So, if I were to give a radical teaching, I have to say a few things about that. It would not be, let me be very clear, a radical non-dual teaching to me would not be focusing just on presence. Because every person that I've seen come through here that I've worked with closely to do this work, I've done this work with them, I found that there was a trauma response over there, or connected to their awareness recognition or their practice. This is a very little known fact in awareness-based teachings and practices, that we're driven by repression, so that when we start to do awareness practices, it's the repression doing it. From a very unconscious level, we're sort of using awareness to kind of feel better and to feel safer and to not have to feel certain things. And it's control, but we're not aware of how it's happening. It's happening from the conditioning of, I don't want to feel something in particular, whatever's buried. And then from that, safer things arise. Things that keep us safe and get us love. Stories that are painful and they are suffering, but they are safer than what we've buried. And that's why they keep arising. This is a little known fact, though. I mean, you guys hear me talk about that suffering comes from repression. And if you read the science, you can see it. But what I'm talking about here is something specific to non-dual teachings. See, I didn't know this either. If I would have known this, this is embarrassing. Frankly, if all teachers knew this, but see, they turn a blind eye like I did. But if all teachers knew this, then they would shift the way that they're teaching, because they would understand that the repression within us is drawn to the awareness pointers and practices for safety. There's no reason that present moment awareness ought to be used for safety, because it's just awareness. Unless, of course, there's trauma. And that's exactly what's going on. So to me, a radical teaching would have to include that. It couldn't just point to awareness and say, well, see how radical this is? Everything comes and goes to this present moment awareness that's always here. Thoughts arise, thoughts fall to this awareness that's here. Feelings arise. They're felt, they're allowed, they fall away to this awareness that's here already. See, this is how teachers talk, and it can sound very radical. But if you don't understand, if you don't understand that people are in a traumatized state and repression is producing all those things that are arising, you might think it's radical. But once you do repression work, it does not at all look, nor is it radical. And what I mean by radical is like getting to the truth of things, like really being clear and direct. And a lot of things that are thought to be clear and direct are actually just part of a massive bypass in spirituality, and including non-duality. It's a little known fact. That's the first thing I want to say, that just pointing to presence or making present moment awareness, especially only, the most important thing, is a big part of the bypass. I've had people that I've worked with who've come to work with me for a while, and they just didn't want to see this. And they left so they could go and teach awareness. I'm telling you it's happening. And this is because repression is driving things. And when you start to say to people, hey, the very thing that you hold so dear, and they don't realize they hold it dear until you start talking about the repression that drives this awareness that they hold dear. And then they start to feel threatened. I mean, I've had conversations with teachers who I was training. I can't tell you their names. I'm going to change the facts for you. But I want you guys to see just how deep the bypass goes. These are teachers, just like me. And they're so innocent on one hand in their bypass, but it's really dangerous on the other hand. These are people who have had different followings and different levels of, success. They come here. Some came before Dan and I found the bypass, and then we found the bypass and they left. They didn't even go into the repression work because they were very resistant. But some stayed around for a while, and they just kept hanging on. But when I started to work with them, and these are teachers who teach other people about present moment awareness. And when I would say things like, when I listen to your insights that you share or your pointers, I hear the repression in it. And the response would be something like, well, what do you mean? Well, you're always thinking about everything. It's like everything is repression and trauma. I'd be like, but it is. What do you mean? I talk that way. I mean, go to the science, look around. The fact that you don't know that is another thing, but I'm not making this stuff up. And when you give me your spiritual resume and say that you've already seen this and that and this and that, that just sounds like the same trauma response. It's trying to stay safe by landing on some shift that's happened or some recognition. And yet I hear the repression in your experience, and if you go into your body, you will find it. And sometimes they go into their bodies and find it, and sometimes they leave because it's just too threatening. But when they leave, they never say to themselves, I'm leaving because I don't want to feel what's buried. They leave by telling themselves whatever they tell themselves to not get to what's buried. And I've seen this happen time and time again with coach, therapist, teacher, trainer, people that come here. So what we did is we closed the gate on training. Talk about radicalizing it. No, you can't get in. It's very difficult. It's not difficult. It's just that you've got to do your own work. You can't just sit there and want to go help people, because suffering runs deep, and suffering and repression is like a contagion. And when you want to go help people and rescue or fix or save and don't even know it because you have repression, you can do damage in people's lives because it's leading people into an avoidant state, avoidant of what they buried. So in order to talk about the radicalized teaching, I have to tell you that things that are out there that purport to be radical aren't, because they don't get to repression. In order to tell you what I think a radicalized or radical, and by I mean really get to the truth of things, here's what I would say it is. It is one part what those teachers are saying, which is the recognition of presence. That's one part of it. You might say, how are there parts in non-duality? And I'll say, that is one of those landings that you have to give up. Because we have to bring wisdom to this. We can't just say things like that. Because one part of it is the recognition of presence. But if you don't bring the emotional repression conditioning, the conditioning that demands that you hold certain emotions back into awareness, the recognition of presence will just be, as I said, watching things come and go forever. Or you can't end suffering if you just focus on present moment awareness, because the very resting is that happens within a body or within an experience of someone who has in their body unconscious trauma. So when you just point to presence, the unconscious trauma, which I mean emotional repression, runs that until you bring with that one part the presence recognition, making the unconscious conscious. When you bring those two things together, recognizing the presence that most teachings are pointing to, and bringing the conditioning into awareness that ends the suffering. When you do those two things together, at some point you stop focusing on the first part, the awareness. Because I'm telling you that focus on awareness, seeking it or having found it, realized it, is still a trauma response. Because a child that was on a conscious planet that just grew up knowing what they are, they're awake and they can feel and allow everything, would not focus on the space in which everything happens. They wouldn't focus there, because look around. There's just so much life. There's so much diversity, feeling, thoughts, experiences, states, creativity, that can happen. If I'm going to sit here and focus on the space in which that all happens, and I am that, I'm running from something. That child who's conscious wouldn't do that, because they've got too many things they want to do. Play, speak, express, feel, be in a relationship, explore, create. We're not going to just sit there and rest as the awareness to which everything comes and goes. And because people are in repression who hear those pointers, they start to get lulled into a state of inertia, which means they wake up to the presence, maybe suddenly, maybe gradually, but the body keeps the score and it still has the repression, and they can't move. Like they can't do what they want to do. They might want to put up a website and share the new insights they have, but they can't. And they don't know why. And many of these teachings say, well, it's just because you're waking up to your true nature, and it basically doesn't care about jack shit. It just sits here and observes everything. That's not radical, because there's no division between awareness and what is, what's happening. So to say that there's this awareness that's just observing everything is just the beginning, if at all that, before you see the true non-duality, which is not that there's an awareness and then things are coming and going that are apart from that awareness, but that life is a dynamic movement. You can't put it into words. You can only live non-dual realization. You really can't put it into words. It's more important to develop a practice that doesn't bypass, so that you can really experience the embodied lived freedom, instead of just, I'm the awareness and everything is coming and going. Or whatever the standard sort of non-dual phrasing is that doesn't take into consideration our unrealized potential. That's the missing key for me when I see a lot of these teachings, except for ones like Eckhart and Almaas who talk about this. But there's just this unrealized potential. Thomas Hübl talks about it in the context of frozen emotion in the body. And when you start talking about frozen emotion in the body and making that conscious, you're talking about discovering our unrealized potential. Because that holds everything we're afraid of. Everything that holds us back, everything that then forces us to identify with stuff that's false, it's all there in those frozen emotions. And it just so happens that those frozen emotions are the sense of separation and non-duality. The very trauma research that you could go read, people like Thomas Hübl that are pointing to frozen emotion, are so in alignment with non-duality, and so many people don't see it. Because he doesn't use that language of awareness, but he's talking about our potential as what we really are. Or Gabor Mate saying that disease gets healed by discovering our authentic self. We're all pointing to this, and it's a different way. We each have a different way of pointing and talking, but and Ken Wilber, there are going to be more and more, there already are more that I'm mentioning, that are just going to say, look, stop the bypassing. You don't have to anymore. You don't have to use awareness or meditation or other practices to just have sort of temporary reprieve from suffering, or just states of peace, or even just a realization that isn't embodied. You don't have to settle anymore for what I would call a mistress. And so a radical teaching would just, here's how I want to talk about what a radical teaching would really do. You would catch yourself. It would be a radical path, not a teaching. The radical teaching destroys the teacher once you get the tools and the context, and you can just experience the freedom yourself. You don't need to have a father or a mother there for years. You just need someone there to guide you and teach you how to do it skillfully. And here's how you catch yourself then. If you want to be really radical, you drop the teacher, stop going to them, because once you get what they can give you, like once you come here and I show you how to do repression inquiry and I point to presence with it, you've got what you need. You might need some mentorship with me or one of us, but you don't need a teacher like right there with you all the time for the rest of your life. For a while. But see, with KI, what's so exciting to me is that people can make it their own. They do it on their own eventually. They still sit with people from time to time. But they just own their own experience. That's radical. Really. To truly get to the root of suffering with a skillful practice, and you don't need someone else to do that, and yet you can have someone there who's done that before if you need it, that's radical, because it breaks the codependency and you catch yourself. It breaks the codependency of needing someone there, although you can have someone there to mentor you. But once we mentor you and show you how to catch yourself, you can just do that yourself. Because you see, we create our own suffering. So a radical approach would be to help you see how you create your own suffering in each moment. And so you can catch yourself. And catch yourself just means, well, it means a few things. It's ending the bypass. It's ending sabotage, self-sabotage. It is ending avoidance to catch yourself. And it might seem like it's impossible or really difficult. It's a skill and a context is what it is. And once you pick up the skill and you use it in your life and you really understand the context, you'll basically bypass. You will. Because your system seeks safety and love and not freedom. But if you're with us, a mentor, for a while, just for a while, so that we can help you catch yourself, you will not use KI to bypass. And this will be the first method that you will not use. I mean, truly. Because if you're still suffering, there's still the avoidance is there. What I tell people is that a radical approach, like KI, you should see suffering start to go away. You should see the benefits in your relationship, in your life, at work, everywhere. And if you don't, you're not doing it skillfully. And I would say just come to a mentor and get the help, and then get back on track and see those benefits. Trust yourself. That to me is radical. When you can actually do inquiry and see the benefits in the way you respond to your lover, to your mom, to your dad, to the people that you just meet on the street. When you see that change, and when you see the changes in your body, like the sense of separation transmuting, you can trust that. What more do you want? And as you see that energy, that sense of separation transmuting, and you recognize presence naturally because you're seeing that the false stuff that the repression creates is not you, but you're not bypassing, then quite naturally you recognize the presence, but you don't overemphasize it. You don't use the presence to avoid the repression here. The presence is just that to which this repression is made conscious. And so you can see that all the suffering that comes and goes to this awareness can go away because we're creating it. Resting as awareness or pointing to no self will not show you how you're creating it. Let's just talk about it as an awakening path, but not everybody calls their life journey an awakening path. And some people would say there's no path. There's just presence. But then we're back to the same bypass. Of course there's just presence. Why is it so difficult for so many people to recognize? A radical practice does not simply point people back to a presence that they're having difficulty recognizing because they have repression. Think about that. It's almost torture. People say, well, I have to effort to recognize presence. And the teachers say, well, just allow the efforting. What I say is, do you know why you're efforting? You're efforting because you're trying to stay away and get away from the emotions that you buried. That's the efforting. And so your system is in a trauma response. If that trauma wasn't there, resting as awareness wouldn't even be a thing. You wouldn't rest as what you are. You just be what you are. See, but when you can't be what you are, when you can't just be here now, that just means it looks like it's stories. See that? It looks like it's an identity or identities. It looks like it's suffering. But what the real reason that we can't be here now has nothing to do with what's arising. The stories come up and they take us over. I totally get it. We become identified with it. I'm not good enough. I'm unworthy. I'm unlovable. And it really feels true. I'm worthless can feel like the very core, actually. And it can feel like that. What could be possibly under that? People think, well, there's just freedom right under that. No, there isn't. There's repression under that. There's not going to be freedom if there's going to be repression there. There might be, if you investigate those stories of worthlessness and feelings and thoughts that come and go, you might get those to quiet some, of course. But that's just like getting some weeds in the garden to kind of not grow as much or not grow at all, but it doesn't change the fact that other weeds are there. So the I'm worthless story might get quieter, or I'm unlovable might get quieter through spiritual practice or realization. Only then you find that you have body contraction or chronic pain, a disease, addiction. I had some of those things. After not really experiencing the deficiency story anymore. I was just walking around Earth as awareness. No story of I'm unlovable. I just had chronic pain. See, that's not radical. The teachers that pointed me to presence, but didn't point me to the festering unconscious that was creating disease and suffering, that was bamboozling me into thinking that that disease and chronic pain had nothing to do with my emotions. It's not radical. It's a bypass. What would be radical would be let's stop lying to ourselves and each other. That's radical. See, to me, the entire non-duality, the whole thing has to go, in a sense. And the only thing that ought to be left standing are the things that truly get to the root and do not use the non-dual language or the traditions or anything, the pointing, to help people who are already in an avoidant pattern from childhood trauma. There are some good teachings out there that would be left standing, but the ones that sit there and pointed people who have repression to just avoid that would have to die in a world that's trauma informed. I don't see how it's going to even last. And what's going to happen is that I think some of the new teachers are going to suffer after a few years. The ones that people consider to be radical right now, actually, because they're too new to it. They haven't seen it yet. Their suffering isn't over. See, when you first recognize presence, well, let me speak for myself. In the non-dual shift that I had in 2007, it's very easy to just, well, that's it. That's ego right there. It really is. Because there is no it. Even that shift itself, it's so easy to bamboozle, to lie to ourselves when we have a realization or a shift. Because we're driven by repression still. Why are we so eager to say we're done? Or even to assume it without saying it? And to turn around and teach others as if this is all you have to do too, is recognize this that I recognize. But how does that teacher know that that's it? Nisargadatta, on his deathbed, shared a lot of realizations that happened after his initial shift. Adyashanti shares tremendous insights around the unfolding of people who do KI understand that the real awakening path is not how it's often sold, as just going to recognize that we're already here, and then once we've recognized it, that's it. Because that's such a cop-out if you understand repression. It's just, okay, now I've had a shift to the presence. Now I really don't have to feel what's buried. Because that's what the buried emotions are doing, even in the shift. As you recognize it, see, the repression just wants to keep us safe. So whatever it can find, it just uses that. Everything. The ego gets created out of experience for safety and to get love until you do the deep work. And then nothing is used by that. I mean, if you're really clear, you're awake from your awakening. You're free from all that. You don't care about any of that anymore if you're really free. You don't care about the awareness recognition, or that your awareness, or that there's nobody here. That those are insights that just go, because they're not the deepest insights. The deepest insights can never be expressed. That's why I don't express them. I just use words to point back to the practice that gets to the root of suffering. Because this is experiential. All of this. These words that I use, these are just words. You guys know that. That's all. You're not missing anything if you don't listen to me. You're missing something if you don't do KI, repression inquiry, I think. But not if you don't listen to me. Seriously. To be radical, it's all on you. Just come and learn the tools. Let us show you how to do them without bypassing, and then it's all on you. That's radical to me. And sometimes we need people. I actually suggest that most people do some form of mentorship for at least a short period of time with us. And I'm going to explain why here. See, any kind of radical teaching or approach would have to deal with just basic trauma responses that are running people. Basic ones. And they get overlooked all the time in things that are considered to be like really radical practices or teachings. They get overlooked all the time. And let me explain it this way. It's the avoidant spiritual path that I've been talking about on YouTube and here. I did a podcast called The Avoidance Guide to Authentic Spirituality to help everybody see it. But basically we've nailed it, just like we nailed the bypass here, guys. We can show it to you, your own conditioning that drives an avoidant pattern. And it's like this. If I put words to it, I'm gonna try to keep it simple at first. This is to me very radical. So you want to know what's radical? This is it. Look, our issues are in our original relationships. Mom and dad, brothers and sisters, what happened when we were kids, but also every important relationship since then. That's where our suffering has come from, and it shaped who we are. Our ego got developed in the context of relationship only. And yet we disconnect from those relationships, and we often then find, well, let's just call it a mistress. I'll come back to that in a second. But first, the disconnection itself. So these are the three signs of avoidant spiritual path. You've got disconnection in relationship, then you got a mistress, and then repeat it. Rinse and repeat. Now you can break that down. And the disconnection is because we can't feel and express what is true for us in our relationships. So we're identified with what's false and we're suffering in our relationships. In separation. So that disconnection drives us away from this fear of feeling and expressing buried emotions, and then the fear of the conflict if we did get angry, or the vulnerability if we did show hurt, and so our system just protects us, and then we disconnect. And then here comes the mistress. Now the reason that I call it a mistress is just because that's symbolic. Okay, this is a broad spectrum of things that we go to if we're avoidant. It could be an actual mistress, like we cheat on our wife. I mean, the reason I'm talking about with the word mistress partly is because of so many spiritual teachers who cheat on their wives or husbands. Why is that happening? Because, well, trauma and unmet needs. Emotional repression driving that. But, if the teacher is just pointing to presence, they're not going to see it. And they're probably going to bamboozle their spouses and their students, because how could they possibly explain why that happened if they're unconscious to this pattern? So that could be a mistress, is that we cheat on our spouse. Well, see, why do we do that? It's not just because this person that we meet is so wonderful. It's because we don't have to be authentic with someone new. We don't get to the buried emotions. That keeps us safe. The same kind of safe that we get by disconnecting from our relationships, our partner. See, we're in a pattern of avoidance of what's buried. So we disconnect the relationship, and then here comes the mistress. But what if we don't really actually have a mistress? Instead, we just fantasize about one. Well, that's actually a very common avoidant attachment pattern sort of sign or symptom, is that after the disconnection, the fantasy. And that's safe, because with the fantasy, we don't have to feel and express what's true. So we get to be avoidant of the buried emotions there in the fantasy, just like we're avoidant of the buried emotions in our relationship. And that's just the beginning of the mistress. Because there's also then the spiritual path or practice or healing or self-help path or practice that can easily become a mistress, because it helps us avoid the buried emotions. If we pick a modality that is a bypass, we don't have to feel or express that stuff that drove us away from our relationships. And so therefore it's a rinse and repeat, that we're not done suffering. Even if we found a so-called radical teaching or practice, if it doesn't get to the buried emotions, we're still in the avoidant pattern. It just might then be disease or chronic pain or an addiction that becomes, there's another mistress. when we don't get to the buried stuff, we create suffering. And then we have to go try to find the answer to that suffering, which is more avoidance of the very root of it, which is right here in our bodies. Everything we're doing in terms of a mistress is an avoidance of what's right here in our bodies. So again, Scott Killaby's teaching 2012, just pointing to presence basically, that's a mistress. That kept everybody safe who was already disconnecting from their relationships. So let's say you go to a really, not Scott Killaby, but even more Neo-Advaita or radicalized teaching and as a mistress, but you don't think it's a mistress. Well, of course you don't, because that kind of teaching wouldn't get to the buried emotions. That's really safe, actually, to sit here and point to how there's already liberation here. Why process anything? You're already fully free, or something like that. See, that's a mistress. There's nothing in that that would even make you come close to having to feel the very buried emotions that created the disconnection in relationship. And ironically, it's a non-dual teaching, which talks about non-separation. Well, disconnection is separation. So if we're going to avoid the buried emotions, we're going to avoid getting to the root of the separation. The bamboozle runs so deep because it's a mistress. You can paint it any way you want. As long as it doesn't get to the buried emotions, you can make it really profound mistress, like the greatest seeming teaching or practice in the world, still avoiding the buried emotions. To just getting on porn or getting on computer and watching porn every night. It serves the same purpose. Everything that I was doing as a teacher was a mistress until Dan and I developed the work that got to that which creates the disconnection, the repression. There are other mistresses. I mean, I said addiction. Anything can be a hobby, a practice, anything. Going to YouTube to watch us teachers can be, if you're not doing the real work of getting to the repression that drives you there. And guys, just because I get excited about it, I don't have any judgment on this. Because I think I'm probably as avoidant or more avoidant, or I was, not now at all. In fact, you talk to the people that I'm in relationship with. They'll tell you, no, he can be a lot, actually. He's not like checking out. He's checking in. But not a lot in a bad way. It's just people aren't used to that. I never lived like this. So what I wanted to say is I was probably had avoidant personality disorder most of my life. That's why I've been able to really see this. Anyway, the mistress, we find a mistress, and therefore we just repeat the whole pattern of avoidance. I mean, if you guys could really see that, and maybe nobody wants that answer, that the answer is your own relationship. The relationships of your life hold the key to your freedom. The very thing that you're afraid of, though. See why the avoidant pattern is there. This is why any radical teaching would have to include that. Otherwise, the avoidant pattern would use the teaching as a mistress. Unless the teaching is very clear and says no. And the teacher says, no, don't use this one that way. Because this is what you asked me, what would radical teaching be? It would be just that. It would say, no, this one is not a mistress. Or you could say, if this is a mistress, KI, repression inquiry, well, this mistress, we're going to get to the buried emotions. This is like meeting somebody on a dating app, and the first thing we do is just get right to the root of things. You're not going to want to stay there, see? You're going to want to go to the person who's just, we play the seduction game and we don't really know each other and we stay safe, right? Because we can stay safe and get love, right? I don't want to kill, by the way, people think if I do this work, this radical work, well, I'll never want to connect. I mean, why would you ever be in a relationship? People have said that. You know what I say? That's the avoidant pattern talking, most likely. Because you're saying that this all goes into some place of disconnection, because you can't imagine real authenticity. I couldn't either. Because it doesn't go there. And of course you would have relationship, because it's all relationship. And you'll enjoy it. And I enjoy it so much more now. Both sex and love and friendship. I enjoy it all. I never enjoyed it before. You know, I had to be radical in order to enjoy life. I had to get radical, guys. Don't settle for present moment awareness. Enthusiasm, enjoy your life. Being creative, being who and what you are. Can you imagine that? That's what a radical approach would bring to your life. It wouldn't just bring some realization that you can tell your friends about or write a book about even. I don't write books anymore because I don't want to show off any realizations. I just want to show you guys these tools. And you can have the realization yourself. After I just showed off my realization. Because I have a lot of freedom. And I don't mind saying. I just don't want to write a book about it because it just feels too removed. We are writing a book, but it's not how I want to share this. What I want to say to people is, I'm going to say a few things here before I go. Because if people are sitting here going, well, what is the radical teaching? Can you pin it down? I'll say no, because that's how you stay safe. It's by trying to pin something down that you can understand. Here's what I'm saying if you want to understand something. 2 things. Yes to what those teachers are saying. I don't disagree with them. Present moment awareness, just this moment, recognition of presence is key. I don't disagree with that. I disagree with the over-focusing on that. Or with the single focus on that. Or, too much focus at all on that. Because just enough is enough in the beginning to help us orient to presence so that we can start making the unconscious conscious, which is the second part. That's the repression inquiry. Put those 2 things together, there's the takeaway for you. I mean, if you want to take away. But to me, it's all these other things too. Because, see, if people don't understand that when they learn the work, if they have an avoidant pattern, they're going to use these tools and bypass. KI. Because it doesn't matter what method you use. Your system seeks safety and love and approval. So when it picks up these tools, it's going to try to bypass. And this is where mentorship and training comes in. What we suggest to people is that one of the reasons that people keep going from teacher to practice to teaching is because they're in an avoidant pattern, first of all. And their systems are seeking safety. But the teachers are also, and the practices, the traditions are also responsible by putting forth practices and pointers that don't get to that which drives the avoidance, the trauma, and repression. So this is a dance going on, between the helpers and the helpees. And until helpers or someone does something different in that, there's not going to be a lot of people actually ending suffering, is what I've seen. We call this we space, but it just means that who's helping you and how you're being helped is critical, because if you're not getting to the repression, and if you're in an avoidant pattern with that helper, for example, or an anxious attachment pattern, then that's going to sabotage that, and you're not going to end the suffering. That's just another mistress. So who you work with is so key. Like I said, the mistress that you pick. So what we're saying to people is that instead of having a bunch of things that you go from one after the other, looking for yourself, get to the root of suffering here. Truly. Empower yourself to become skillful to actually end suffering by seeing that you create it in every moment. Your system produces suffering to keep you safe and get you love. You just don't know it. It's not in the mind. You can't sit here and hear it and say, I know it, Because you don't know it until you've made it conscious. You're making it conscious, I mean. That's how you know it in direct experience. It becomes the way that you experience. You come out of repression. You end suffering. So mentorship is what I'm suggesting. So that you don't just keep going from thing to thing to thing, mistress to mistress to mistress. Pick a mistress, me or one of the mentors here, who will show you how to do this work in the way that it was developed. And then this is not just another mistress then. You start to end the suffering then. And then when you want to go someplace else to try to stay safe and find a mistress that you don't get to the buried motions with, like some meditation, will say, go and do it. But catch yourself. If you want to be radical, you'll catch yourself. You don't want to just go to another practice or a teaching on the side while you're doing this work just to do the same thing you've always done your whole life. Without us saying, hey, no, let me show you. Let me show you what you're doing. And this is the value of mentorship, is if you work with us for a period of time, you don't have to keep going from teacher to practice, because that's the avoidant pattern. And we get to the emotional repression and the avoidant pattern directly here. We teach you how to make it conscious. What could be more radical than to make conscious the very thing that's making it impossible for you to end suffering? If you truly understand trauma, your head would be shaking up and down right now. Like, yeah, of course, I'm being driven on trauma responses. No matter how many times I look at the stories that those responses create, or the shadows or the narratives, it doesn't matter, because I have trauma responses buried in my body. We can expect more suffering when that's the case. And what I won't do if I mentor you or train you is people please you. And because I don't have any stored anger, I'm very hard to trigger. But you'll see all of me. Meaning, I will share stories with you of when I couldn't get angry, and then what it was like when I could feel that but couldn't express it. And then what it was like, had a little glitch there in the system. Hope you can hear me now. I will share with people when I'm mentoring them that the ups and downs that I experience in this process, the tremendous freedom that I've experienced, but also the challenges, like the avoidant pattern that I've been running on my whole life. Because you see, that's the way I think the teaching should happen, is that there should really be authenticity. And I think if you talk to the people that I train or mentor, they'll tell you that. I'm sure they will, because I think that some people are shocked at how open I am. Frankly, recently, a couple of mentees said that. They were like, I had no idea that it would be like this. Where it's like, I'll share something and you'll just come back and share something equally sensitive. I'm like, because I don't care what people think. You guys, I want to leave you with this. This is the thing that people don't understand about repression work. Well, maybe you do, but until you experience it, this is what the teachings talk about, but how the hell do you experience it when you have repression? Meaning, experience what? Where you don't need love and approval. You don't feel that anywhere in your being anymore. You don't need it from people, which means you can love people. After a lifetime of disconnection, you can truly open to yourself and others. Do you see what I mean? It's energetic. It isn't just I'm the awareness and you're the awareness. That's still separation. There's none of that. It's just such a natural way of being. You'll see it. And awareness is part of that, of course. But the biggest part of it is just an energetic shifting into what you really are. What I am. I'm having the fucking time of my life, guys. And I'm sitting on a bathroom floor in a hotel room right now. But I'm having the time of my life. because I'm doing exactly what I want. And it's not teaching. It's everything that I do, because it's when you clear the repression, you just get to enjoy being yourself. I don't know how else to say it. And it is not narcissism. That's a limited view. I heard somebody say that. So if you love yourself, you're just a narcissist? No. A hammer only sees nails. So you're seeing a nail is all, because you've got this conditioning in you that you can't imagine that there's a possibility of loving yourself, but the self is empty. It's an experience you can't describe, because we only know ego consciousness. And even when we hear, people talk about awakening, what I'm talking about is embodying it. It's not just awakening. It's everything I ever wanted. I can't believe that I enjoy people now. It's hard to put my mind around. If you understood my life, I was always a loner. My mom said that when I was 18. This work has shifted me so much that at the beginning of a relationship, I'll just talk about really important things. And people, I'm sure it scares some people, because I know it's real though. I know that, like, if you and I don't really open to each other, we can't have a real relationship or a friendship, a business relationship. If we disconnect, like I've been talking about, we can't do it. No matter what it is. A marriage, we can't do it. I've tried. Separation is suffering. And relationships really don't work, do they? Wait till you clear repression and watch relationships work a completely different way. And by the way, before I leave, while you're doing the repression work, there'll be ups and downs, because your system will try to keep you safe. It'll produce suffering for you. That doesn't mean you can't end that suffering by seeing where it comes from, though. If you understand your system seeks safety and wants love, then when suffering comes up when you're doing this work, you're just going to be like this. Oh, well, there it is. It sucks. It's painful. But I know how to process now. I don't have to suffer. A radical teaching or approach always gets to the very root of something. Right to it. If it doesn't, it's being driven by the root. There's an agenda there with spiritual practice when we do not focus on emotional repression. And the agenda is not freedom. It's stay safe, get love. A radical approach would appreciate that from the beginning, that we are not here to be free. We may say that. You see, that's how the bypass happens, is by saying that to each other, or that we have found it instead of paying attention to what's really true and being earnest and honest and mature. A mature person on a spiritual path does not sit there and say, I'm just chasing awakening, without investigating where that comes from. Perhaps awakening is already here. Awareness is here, like the teachings say. But maybe there's something in you that says it can't be here because I'm scared to be here. That's something that you should investigate. Instead of just, blindly being interested in awakening. But also, when someone points you to say it's already here. If it were already here for you to recognize, you wouldn't be suffering. If it were that easy for a teacher to say, look, you're already that. Okay, if you recognize that, then there should be no suffering. I mean that. And the truth is, it doesn't happen that way. That's the truth. Now, here's what happens. So watch for this. Here's my last thought for you. What really happens on the awakening path, if you notice, is that there's a honeymoon period. Many people start to teach during the honeymoon period. It's just right after the realization, and it's very innocent, but they do. And I did. And we're teaching and pointing then from unresolved trauma. It doesn't mean the pointing isn't good and helpful and clear. It is in many cases, but it's still, if there's trauma and repression, it's driving that. And that's why the pointing is not pointing back to the repression, because repression is driving it. But the people who do that will never admit that. They wouldn't even know it, because you have to go into your body to see where your activity is coming from. The way that you operate is happening for a reason. I wasn't just pointing to presence because it was a good idea or that it brought people freedom. It kept everybody safe. It kept me safe from the buried anger. So I didn't have to feel and express what was true to my loved ones, so I could stay disconnected from people. So I could stay in separation. Yeah, I was using non-duality to stay in separation. If you didn't get that from this podcast episode, you might want to listen again, because you might be using awakening or non-duality to stay in disconnection in your relationships. Because if awakening, practice, or teaching is a mistress that doesn't get to the buried emotions, that's what you're doing. And that, my friends, would be my radical teaching. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in starting the work, I always put in the description in the episodes, links to either do it yourself or do it with a mentor. Now let me explain that for a second. Why do we have two different things? Because one is for the avoidant attachment, seriously, and the other one is for a more anxious attachment to get started. In other words, an avoidant would want to find a mistress. An avoidant doesn't want to get to the buried emotions, right? And would then maybe not want to do mentorship, for example. That gets too close. It could be too intimate. So they can do it yourself by learning the work and then seeing where that disconnection and avoidance comes from. And then what we would do is when you start to learn it on your own through this series of recordings, there are live support calls with us. And you don't have to speak up. And you can actually just sit there and continue. And I mean that. People do that. They don't want to connect one-on-one. And so a live support call is helpful. And then in those live support calls, we're going to show you how you have to be careful. When you learn the work on your own, your system wants a bypass because it's seeking safety. And then we're going to try to help you and maybe even invite many of you into mentorship. So let me say this. If you have an avoidant pattern in you, and you've been listening to my stuff and you found that pattern in you, you're probably not going to be able to end the suffering unless you do at least a little bit of either mentorship or a few sessions with us. And here's why. This is just how it is, because the avoidant pattern wants to find a mistress. It wants to turn KI into a mistress from the unconscious level. And in order to correct that, we want to show you, just be in our lives for just a little bit. I know that might be challenging for some people, but can you be in our lives a little bit after you learn KI so that we make sure that you don't use it as a mistress and bypass? That's all. And then you can cut loose and continue to do the work and free yourself from that suffering. Okay, and then there's also a link to mentorship. And by the way, if you're someone who's avoidant and you want to go into mentorship, go. That's perfect. But sometimes people with a more anxious attachment are drawn to mentorship because they can be with someone and get that assurance that they're doing it right. There are a whole bunch of issues with that too. It's not like we're not just here trying to make money. Like, let's bring as many people with anxious attachment to us and take all their money. No, what we do is we help them support themselves in mentorship to start really doing the work on their own and not feeling so attached to the mentor or the teacher or the trainer. That's what sets them free, even if we don't get all their money in the end. That's how we're operating. And then the avoidant, so we're just trying to help you because we know that you're not going to jump into the mentorship with us. So if we don't give you something out there to learn the work, many of you will just keep coming to my videos and not learning it. We've seen it. We've seen even some of you come into the work who have the avoidant pattern, and you'll come in for a while and you'll sabotage and leave. That's all okay, but I want you to know that a radical approach or teaching would help you catch that and catch yourself in your tracks. Thank you for listening.